Welcome to the first episode, or the first part rather, of the Indian Debating League motion breakdown series, where we're going to be breaking down all motions from the, or if not all, at least as many as we can, from the Sofia WUDC happening right now in Sofia, Bulgaria. The first round motion has to do with economics. My name is Krishaang Kohli, and I will be breaking this motion down for you. The first thing that I want to talk about is who exactly is this session for, who can benefit from this session. I believe that this session is differently useful to to a decent gradient of people, but where everyone has maybe something different that they can pick up. So, of course, if you're a novice debater, if you're new to debating, if you're new to BP debating, and you want to learn how to make extensions, all of that kind of stuff, if nothing else, this would be a good video for you to be able to have a certain amount of insight into a debater's head who's been debating for an unnecessarily long period of time. But I also think that this session could be quite useful to people who are intermediate at an intermediate level in debating, who are maybe at an advanced level in debating, but for whatever reason have an irrational aversion to economics and debating economics motions or hard motions in general. I think that it's quite true that economics as a theme in debate ends up being quite similar to how math used to be in school, where a lot of people were just irrationally afraid of it. I think this is also the case in debating. So in this breakdown, I will also be covering how we can generate cases from first principles without knowing a lot of spec about the specific economics of a country that we're given in a motion or a region that we're given in a motion. Of course, spec helps, and I will also be talking about how spec helps. One more thing, I think it would be very helpful if all of you guys could give me as much feedback as possible about the way that this session was structured, how long it was, how in depth it went, and if there are any questions that you would want me to answer, any of these things, because all your feedback will be very, very helpful when we are making videos for round 2, round 3, so on and so forth, as much as we're able to do whatever you guys are interested in. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's start. What is the motion? So, yeah. Okay, it's going too fast. Right. So, the motion is this House believes that Bulgaria should adopt a progressive tax system, and the world CAs have been very nice and polite and given us an info slide. So the info slide details two things. Of course, it says that Bulgaria has a flat tax system, they have 10% income tax, etc. The info slide, in terms of meta, is giving us two things. The first thing that it is doing is that it's explaining status quo. They're saying that there's already a flat tax. So what this is useful for is this is useful for you to be able to identify how much margin there actually is in the round. So if you know what status quo is like, and now you know what this new world is going to be like, where this progressive tax system is going to exist, you at least have some amount of intuition for the extent of change that is going to happen. The second thing they tell us is what a progressive tax system is, presumably to be able to make the debate clean, ensure there's no unfair modeling and all of that kind of stuff. So it's just it's a tax rate that's going to keep increasing as taxable income increases. It's a pretty simple motion when it comes to what type of motion it actually is. But still, there are a couple of important burdens that we need to take care of before I come to the, what's it called? Yeah, the important spec or potentially useful spec. So there's a couple important burdens that I think are useful to know, if not necessary to know. The first is that since this house believes that X should do Y motion, opening government has fiat to model, opening opposition has fiat to counter model. You can call it a proposition, you can call it a model, you can call it a policy, whatever. Personally, I will say that in this motion, I don't see a high amount of utility of providing a big, long, deep model unless you can tie it into spec. And I will come to what spec you could potentially tie it to. But what would the expected modeling be in this kind of motion? You would basically be expected to, I mean, not expected, but it would be good to explain a couple things. The first is how much tax every single slab of people will have to cover, or will have to give rather, to the state. So if you earn up to X amount of currency, how much tax will you have to give, and so on and so forth. You don't necessarily need to talk about like amounts of currency. Model could be as simple as saying like, I don't know, the bottom 10% pay no tax, the people who are the next 20% pay 10% tax, the next 20% pay 30% tax, and so on and so forth. I think why this burden is more relevant is because of counter modeling, because I think there is a significant amount of scope for opening opposition to be able to co-opt a lot of gov benefits just through some clever counter modeling. For example, if opening opposition says that, and of course, my recommendation is whenever you're providing a model or counter model, use a reasonable amount of fiat, but also make sure you're explaining to the judge how much fiat there is and why this extent matters. Like, I'll explain this in a second, but here's what I'm trying to basically say. I'm trying to say that if I'm on opening opposition and I'm trying to create some sort of counter model, the first thing that I would want to do to be able to create this counter model is to explain just how many resources will be utilized just to have a model on Gov, just to be able to pass and execute this policy. So of course, there's a certain amount of political will that will go into it. But more importantly, you can spend a lot of time talking about how you will need to, I don't know, revamp the entire country's bureaucracy to be able to adjust to this kind of taxation system. It'll have ripple on effects onto other forms of taxes that people might want to have or might not want to have in this country, and so on and so forth. You'll have to talk about how you'll probably have to set up new bodies to be able to monitor how many people are paying tax, how many people are not paying tax, or more specifically, how many people are able to pay tax of the changed bracket, the altered bracket. It would also be important in order to pass this policy and execute this policy to invest a significant amount of money into awareness so that people actually know how much tax they have to pay. Because, as is the case in many countries, Hanlon's razor applies, right? Which is, there's no need to assume malice when there is an equal likelihood of incompetence. And for the vast majority of people, whenever there are big tax related changes in a country, the reason that they don't comply with these changes is not because they're mad at the changes, but because they didn't know that there was a change, or they don't know how to comply. The biggest reason, I mean, except for super rich people, that most people aren't able to pay the exact amount of tax that they should pay is because they just don't know how much tax needs to be paid. So a lot of money and resources will have to be spent into this awareness. When you're opening opposition and you explain all of this time explaining what a good gov model, the amount of resources and fiat a good gov model would require, what this allows you to do is to be able to explain why there is the counter model that you have. In this specific case, that what I'm thinking of is we could invest in better and more efficient tax collection, both in terms of spread and how many people we're able to cover, but also in terms of depth, in terms of how accurate the taxes we're able to take are, as well as enforcement to be able to catch people who've evaded taxes in the past and deter people from evading them in the future, giving better punishments. If you just say that this is your counter model, any gov team with half a mind is going to come and say, oh, we can do all this stuff as well. This is inexclusive. So in these kinds of motions, in order to prove that your counter model is exclusive, it is very, very useful to be able to explain just how many more resources than the status quo gov is spending just to pass and execute this policy. So the amount of additional investment that you're able to do into these pre-existing things, such as tax collection systems, such as enforcement systems, deterrence of evasion, and so on and so forth, why this additional investment really matters and is really going to improve the efficacy of pre-existing systems. Yeah, so I think that's the first thing that's important when it comes to modeling. The second is that just because this motion is kind of an actor's motion, because we're very specifically talking about Bulgaria, we're very specifically saying Bulgaria should do this. It is quite, and we're also using fiat from the perspective of Bulgaria. So the amount of resources that we have available to us to use are just the free amount of resources that Bulgaria would have to use. When people know this, it's a very common trap that people fall into, which is that, oh, so the benefit to Bulgaria is going to be the biggest consideration in the round by default. I don't think this is a very harmful trap, to be honest, because there is obviously a lot of debate to be had in Bulgaria, especially in this specific motion. And in order to prove effects beyond Bulgaria, you need to probably have a certain amount of spec. So in this motion, I don't necessarily think it's the biggest issue to be able to assume this. But in general, I would want to point out that by virtue of the motion type, THBT should do Y, you're going to be judging the end amount of utility that's going to happen unto society or unto everything, like the universal set of everything, as opposed to necessarily just having to prove that these are the benefits to Bulgaria. So the true burden of the motion is simply to provide harms and benefits to any important actor, provided that you're proving why that actor is so important, whether they need the harm or benefit a lot. I mean, you don't really need harms, but I mean, some people do. But also, why the extent of harm or benefit is something that is big, why it is something that could be uniquely caused by this, and so on and so forth. So there is an opportunity for spread in this motion, but I do think that in most rooms, the likely debate that's going to happen is likely just about Bulgaria. So I don't think it's a huge issue if you aren't able to expand your case beyond Bulgaria, but I would just note that in this specific type of motion, THBT X should do Y. You should not assume that that is the only consideration. Okay, now I want to talk about some useful spec. So if you know this is something that is useful to not necessarily premise your case, but to either give you an idea of where your case could go and the things that you would want to prove. So if you know some of these things, it would be beneficial because you would be more easily able to identify the incentives of Bulgaria, the needs, wants, demands, priorities, whatever, but also the surrounding conditions. I do think the more strategic way to use spec is to accentuate impacts and to complete cases as compared to having the spec be the premise of the case. Because for any reason, if the judge does not buy your spec, it would be sad to see you lose a round. Okay, but let's talk about what this useful spec could be. So the first thing that I've written here is that Bulgaria has one of the lowest tax rates in Europe. So I think that this is useful spec to have because it affects the debates. It affects the debate in terms of the alternative countries and what the expectations of people running businesses in the specific area are going to have. So the motion already does something, right? Like I was talking about earlier, the motion already says that Bulgaria in status quo has a flat tax system. That's well and good. But that does give us a hint of the margin without necessarily explaining the entire extent of the margin. So if you know that the alternatives usually have a much higher tax, so it's useful to know that they have progressive systems, but more importantly, it's useful to know what the cap of these progressive systems are, which is 40% to 55% and so on and so forth. So if you know this, then it will be useful for you later to be able to prove or disprove which other sorts of countries could even be perceived as alternatives to Bulgaria if people try to flee this country, or how appealing on a comparative those other countries are. This is also potentially useful spec to have because if you're trying to explain a more in-depth model on opening government with regards to the extent of taxes that you would apply to each specific slab of people or proportion of the earning population, this could be useful because you know that you just don't need to cross 40 to 55. And if you don't cross that, that is something that the amount of backlash that this policy is going to have might not be as high as opposition would want the panel to believe. Another piece of useful spec here is that Bulgaria consistently ranks amongst the most unequal countries in the EU. So Bulgaria has one of the highest Gini coefficients. I should have written what a Gini coefficient is, but a Gini coefficient is basically it's a statistical tool. It's a metric that goes between 0 and 1. And it measures how unequal a country is and what the income distribution in that country is. So a Gini coefficient of 0, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong here, of course, I'm going off of pure memory, but a Gini coefficient of 0 is a country of perfect equality and perfect distribution, and a Gini coefficient of 1 signifies a country that has one person holding all wealth in the country and everyone else having none. So there is a lot of income inequality in terms of like your class, but also in terms of regional disparities. So urban inequality is potentially less than rural inequality. I mean, there are poverty is a bigger issue in rural areas as compared to urban areas and stuff like that. The third thing to note is that tax revenue as a percentage of GDP in Bulgaria is relatively low. So again, this is useful if you know the comparative. So if you know that Bulgaria is currently unable to make up a significant amount of its GDP in terms of its collected taxes when you compare it to most other EU states, and why this is something that's bad is because, I mean, if the state has less money, the state can't state well, it can't do all of its state functions as well. The fourth is that Bulgaria has a significant informal economy and a tax evasion problem. So, and this is potentially a reason as to why tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is low, because lots of people are trying to run away from taxes and a very large informal sector exists, which you maybe would not expect in Europe, but is quite common in specific Eastern European countries. And if you know this and don't know much else about Bulgaria, it is also easier for you to be able to analogize Bulgaria to other developing countries, particularly in Asia and Africa, and be able to make educated guesses on the basis of that. So it would be useful to know that Bulgaria has many people who try to evade taxes, but also there's an entire sector of the population that makes tax-free money and the government is not able to regulate it. The last thing, which is also important to note, I mean, obviously it's not the last thing. There's a lot to know about Bulgaria. It's a great country, but Bulgaria faces demographic pressure and emigration of skilled labor. So people who are well educated in Bulgaria, who have skills, who have talents, who have degrees, these sorts of people usually try to flee to greener pastures in Western Europe. So the brain drain issue, once again, which is common to a lot of developing countries, also exists in Bulgaria. So The purpose of knowing the spec can be used is that the spec can be used to accentuate arguments, potentially complete arguments, potentially explain the need for this policy or the harm that this policy can cause. These are things that I will be talking about later. So, but first, I do want to try to maybe build the most basic sorts of cases from a spec illiterate perspective. So, let's assume that you know absolutely nothing about Bulgaria or the EU. So, in this kind of motion, the most obvious expected debate that you're going to have is whether progressive taxation is something that is good or not, right? For a variety of reasons, which are your arguments. Gov, which is opening government, will say yes, progressive taxation is great. Opposition will say no, progressive taxation is not good, it's horrible, or at the very least, it's net neutral. So what could opening government say, and what is the most obvious sort of stock impact that opening government could have? And this is the kind of impact, again, to prove this kind of impact, you don't necessarily need to know anything about Bulgaria or anything beyond what the context slide tells you, is that there's going to be increased state capacity. So when you are taxing people who are richer, more, a higher percentage of their income, a higher percentage of their assets, there is going to be a lot of stuff that will come under taxation, which previously was not covered under taxation. So the immediate impact that this is obviously going to have is that the government of Bulgaria will have more money. And of course, there's a bunch of ways to mitigate it. There's a bunch of attacks from opening opposition or any opposition team could have, but this is the most basic quote unquote stock of impact. The reason that I bring up this impact is to illustrate a couple things. First is to note that if you're intermediate or advanced, this is the kind of argument that you should be expecting the opening government team to run. If you are on opening government, I would say in most cases, contrary to what maybe I'm known for, but I would say that running the most intuitive case to its absolute limit and then trying to figure out the number of impacts that you could derive once this original case is completely proven is really, really useful and leads to a lot of OG wins. But even if you don't know this, I think if you're intermediate or advanced, you should be able to preempt and predict that opening government will run this claim and be ready to explain how your claim interacts with this claim. If you're closing government, you should already be thinking beyond this claim and you shouldn't be stopping at improved state capacity, because if you do, then once you're in the round, there'll be the issue of you having to scratch out all your sheets and a bunch of that stuff. So I think that this is something that you should expect opening government to run. What is the necessary burden for this argument to be proven? I think that the absolute bare minimum necessary burden for this to even be perceived as a benefit in this debate is that this money will be used well. Because at the end of the day, until and unless you're proving this burden, that this money is going to go towards something that will create some sort of positive utility, all you're doing is taking money away from rich people and putting that money into the pockets of the Bulgarian state. I mean, maybe there's an argument to be made that making rich people a little poorer is also a good thing. But again, I don't think that that's maybe a very, very likely argument to be bought. While it is an interesting one to think about. So, yeah, I think that this is the biggest, most important burden, which is why this money will be used well. And once again, irrespective of whether you know anything about Bulgaria or the European Union, you should be thinking about what could a government do with more money. So if a government had more money, what could it do with it? What are positive steps that it could be taking with this extra money that it did not have yesterday? So even if, again, if you know nothing, absolutely nothing, this is something that I keep stressing. If you know absolutely nothing about Bulgaria or the European Union, you could still explain how they could use this money for welfare, for example, to be able to give people from marginalized communities a better standard of life. They could use this money for education. They could use this money to improve health services. And these are the most basic sorts of impacts that you can draw with the state having more money. If again here you have any kind of specific spec with regards to specific spec, that's that's redundant. But if you do have any spec that specifically shows a deficiency of the Bulgarian government, so if you know that, for example, the Bulgarian government has insufficient investment in rural education, which is an issue in Bulgaria right now. Wait just a second. Yeah, so if you explain that Bulgaria has an issue running rural education, which leads to a big rural urban divide in Bulgaria, which leads to all sorts of different things when it comes to rural to urban migration or the lack of the inverse or so on and so forth. And potentially you can explain why this is a very important thing and the increase to state capacity is absolutely necessary. So again, this is the bare minimum burden that you need to fill. If you don't have spec, you should still be able to fill it. If you do have spec, you can very easily explain why your spec is really important. There are some helpful burdens as well here, which increase the viability of your argumentation. First is, why is this a lot of money? And always, I believe in any kind of debate, or in at least most kinds of debates where you are trying to deal with an increase or a decrease to capacity, it is quite useful to be the team that explains that the amount of this capacity is a big amount, because a lot of harms or benefits depend upon the actual quantum of capacity and the actual delta that happens in the debate. Again, it would also be useful to explain why is this money needed, and why the comparative is so bad. I think this is something that I already talked about here, about like where this money could be invested. But in the necessary burden, when I was talking about why this money would be used well, the main thing that you need to explain here is what are the different systems or mechanisms in place that ensure that the state having more money is actually leading to the state using that money, as opposed to just keeping that money. And here is where you explain check and balance mechanisms. So once again, if you know absolutely nothing about Bulgaria, you need to explain what these check and balance mechanisms are in any kind of functional democracy. So what are the different ways in which people hold the government accountable? What are the electoral incentives? What are international incentives? Whatever. What are various forms of incentives for the government to be held accountable, and why people are able to exercise these mechanisms? What are the institutions that exist in this country or in any other country to ensure that the government actually does what it's supposed to do? So again, I think I went on a bit of a tangent earlier, but it's not very useful to just explain where this money could be used without actually filling the preliminary burden of why this will be used well, why the government maybe already wants to use it well, and even if they don't, why people are still able to ensure that this money is used well. All of these burdens are also very easy lines of attack for opposition. So even if you prove that there is increased state capacity, the first line of attack is no, there won't be, because state won't be able to collect money. The way to avoid this is to be able to have a well-explained model. If you aren't able to prove the necessary burden as to why this money will be used well, opposition could very easily be able to explain that all this is doing is taking money out of people's pockets, and not just rich people, but all sorts of people's pockets, and not doing anything with it is something that is worse. You're making people poorer without compensation. If you don't explain why this is a lot of money, then even if you prove that this is going to be used well, opposition could say that the amount of change you're making is not worth the amount of money that you're investing. You could invest the same amount of money in trying to use it well, or like instead of investing so many resources into revamping your entire tax system of the whole country, you could be using the same amount of resources and directly funneling them into welfare or education or whatever you want to. So that's why we fill burdens, because every burden that we leave unfilled is an easy line for opposition to attack. When you are making case, you should always be thinking about what the most obvious case from the other side could be, and also what the most basic burdens are that they need to fill. What a lot of people often do in rounds is that they just give away these burdens in POIs to other teams, especially in the first speeches of other teams. That, for example, let's say the burden of why will this money be used well. Let's say I'm prime minister and giving my speech, blah, 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 blah. And what I often see in rounds is there'll be a closing opposition POI, and they will say, hey, you are making a lot of money, but why will this money be used well? That's really not a useful POI at all, because it tells the opening government, the first speaker, but more importantly, the second speaker, that, oh yeah, of course, there's something I need to explain. It would be way more useful to withhold that and then point it out. So I see a lot of people doing burden pushing, which is not very useful when you're actually helping teams fill those burdens. I think what is more useful is to disprove the burden, or like prove the opposite of that burden, and then be able to weaponize that into whatever your case is. Anyway, let's come to the second potential argument that could be run, and this is, I think, the most obvious opening opposition argument, which is that there's going to be a certain amount of capital fright, which is that rich people or businesses that will flee the country. So capital flight is just a fancy way to say that people will fly away, people will not want to stay in this country anymore because they have to pay a lot of taxes, and taxes are a deterrent. Everyone hates taxes. What is the necessary burden here? I think in this specific case, when you're trying to prove that people's behavior will change, you need to prove why the extent of taxation is a bigger harm than the harms of fleeing the country. Because every single person that you are saying, or every single organization or business that you're going to be saying is going to be affected by this enough to flee the country, you need to accept that they will fundamentally be making a trade-off. They could have fled the country already. They did not, because fleeing the country would be at least a certain amount of inconvenience, and being in Bulgaria at least had a certain amount of benefit. So you need to prove why the extent of taxation. So the amount of change in taxation is a bigger harm into the lives of these people than the harm of just going to other countries. So again, this burden has ancillary burdens, or at least approaches to fill this burden. So for example, like you could prove what the alternative countries are where these people could be fleeing. You could also prove what is the social utility of having rich people or business owners or a large number of businesses in a country. These are potentially helpful burdens to fill. But at the end of the day, the fulcrum of your case is, and what your case is completely contingent on, is to prove that this extent of taxation is big enough and scary enough for people to actually want to do this, and see that the grass is greener on other sides. Of course, you could impact this out, and you could explain why this is so bad, why these actors are very necessary for a country. Yeah, I think this is the most obvious opening opposition case. I think a team should also be trying to beat this case, or attack this case, or rebut this case by attacking these ends. For example, I think Gov team should obviously be trying to prove that the alternatives aren't as appealing and potentially worse, or that the process of emigration is something that is potentially worse. Gov could explain that the state would still have incentives to want to retain these people, and they might exercise those incentives in non-tax ways, and that might be a good thing. I don't know, giving cheap credit or whatever. So there are multiple ways for maybe Gov to try to mitigate this. Again, you need to be able to prove that this is going to be a deterrent. I think the best way to be able to run this case, at least in terms of on opening opposition, is to, again, just talk about what the utility is of having a large number of businesses in the country. Things that immediately come to mind are that when you have a significant number of businesses, that means there's bigger and better competition. You could talk about why that leads to better products for people, better quality products, why that leads to better legislation, why that leads to better enforcement of all other sorts of, say, like laws that prevent exploitation and stuff, because big businesses hold each other in check. They help the government hold each other in check, and so on. And then you explain the comparative, explain what's going to happen when all these businesses flee the country, how that could lead to, what sort of market environment that could lead to. So if you know a little bit about economics, and you know that lack of competition leads to things like monopolies, duopolies, oligopolies. One monopoly is where one company controls the entire sector more or less, or dominates the entire sector. Duopoly is two. Oligopoly is when oligarchs, people who are very rich and have a lot of dynastic family wealth, are able to control the affairs of an entire sector or even an entire country in many cases. So you can explain why these things are likely on the comparative. Once you do exercise this policy, why one of these systems or more of these systems could come into play, and then you explain why that is bad for the consumer. So I think this is the simplest way to run these cases. I hope that you could see that we did not necessarily need to know a lot about Bulgaria or even economics to run this. All we needed to know was how competition works, how maybe more people competing is usually a good thing. We needed to explain how the purpose of government is, and why government even takes people's money in the first place, and why them being able to take more money would be a good thing, because they would use that money in good ways. So I think this is the most basic way that you could approach this motion. But just because it's basic does not necessarily mean it's a poor way to approach this motion. I think, as I said earlier, if you complete one of these approaches, that's usually a good path to victory. You're an opening team. Now I want to talk about a couple of extension ideas and how you could potentially extend on these most obvious cases from opening. So like I said, if you're a CG team or a CO team and you're looking at this motion, first thing that you should obviously try to do is to figure out what the top half clash is going to be. In this specific case, the most likely top half clash is there's government that is able to provide more services to people because they have more money, versus private people who are leaving the country and hence providing less services to people, and this becomes the clash. So the easiest way to try to extend, irrespective of anything as I'm going to talk about, is to try to break that clash. So the easiest way to extend would be to, on CG, try to explain why the government is better than private players, or on CO to be able to try to explain why private players are better than the government. And again, if you note, I don't think that either of these approaches require any spec at all. It is quite a basic debating clash as to whether privatization is better or keeping stuff in the hands of the state is better. I think there's a bunch of reasons to be able to prove either thing, and you don't necessarily need to know anything about Bulgaria or the EU to be able to say this. Let's come to strategies that I have that I would like to explain to you about how we can introduce spec into a debate at closing and then try to use that to be able to carve out an extension for ourselves. I don't recommend having your sole extension be just a spec introduction, but it is a good backup for when you do have another extension that you can run. For example, if I'm CG and I'm trying to run that deadlock breaker as an extension, but the opening is a good team that knows how to do weighing and actually uses that deadlock breaker to weigh their argument against the other team. In that case, where I don't have anything else, I just know a little bit, it is good to try to weaponize my knowledge. The most simple ways to be able to introduce spec into a debate is to A, create a problem or explain the need or the need metric. So for any benefit that is caused in a debate, the only way that that benefit seems complete is if you're able to explain that there was a need for this benefit in the first place. Because if this benefit was not very needed or necessary, it is very tough for people to be able to ground that benefit at all. How do we do this? So let's just go to the spec part. So for example, I said that Bulgaria has an issue, which is that tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is very low. So Bulgaria isn't making enough money with taxes. And because they aren't making enough money with taxes, it is very easy to be able to explain that Bulgarian welfare systems are underfunded. So this creates the need for your opening government solution, which is to increase state capacity. If you're able to prove that the Bulgarian state does not have capacity in the first place. Note that I've also written as to why this would be a helpful burden for opening to fill. But again, you can fill it analytically, you can fill it with spec. Ideally, you should use both. The second good way that you can potentially use spec is to be able to neutralize or flip the other team's claims. So I'll give you an example once again. So say here that Bulgaria has a significant formal economy and a tax evasion problem. But this, if you know this and you belong to opposition, what you can very easily do is you can undercut the extent of the benefit or the benefit overall that opening government has in the debate, which is that they are trying to increase state capacity. You can very easily say that that's useless because state capacity won't really increase all that much because you can't enforce this because there's a historic issue. But also what you can do is you can flip this claim entirely, and you could say that this is going to reduce state capacity because the informal sector will just get stronger. People will find more and more ways to try to evade laws, and the state will inevitably end up spending more money on preventing this evasion or catching this evasion and catching the evaders as compared to the amount of money that they are making through taxes. So you can flip this entire claim and you can prove that opening government does not have a net positive. That is something that you can do if you have the spec that this is something that's this is a mechanism in this country that's weak with regards to evasion and stuff like that. So the whole point of this exercise on how to introduce spec is that I think spec is usually more useful to complete your claims and to complete other people's claims. I also think that it is also more useful as an arrow to something as compared to just the premise of something entirely. So yeah, that's about it on how to introduce spec. Now I want to come to a couple of different ideas that we can have in extension in this debate, even if you don't necessarily have a lot of spec. And then we can also talk about how these extensions work and how I came up with them. So yeah, first up is that closing government is that there's going to be more compliance and collection. Because again, in the earlier case that I was trying to tell you about, where we were talking about how compliance isn't high and where I was saying that opposition could use that as the premise of their extension to try to neutralize the other team, I think it is potentially more useful to not do it in the way that I just explained it, that having be your entire premise, but try to use that as one part of your entire argument. So first, what you could explain is why didn't people already comply? For this, you don't need to know why people really truly did not comply. All you needed to know is that compliance was not high. And that is how I'm using the spec in this kind of way. So why did people not comply? One of the potential reasons that I could say is that people don't want to comply to laws when they don't comply with laws rather, when they don't feel like those laws are fair. So people from the middle class don't want to pay taxes because they believe that if we pay taxes, there's a very low burden on rich people to pay taxes. because the state already squeezes us and gets a lot of money. Because of this, we don't, and these laws aren't fair because rich people don't have to pay as much tax. They can get away with tax. So why are we even paying taxes anyway? Or you could say that middle class people could potentially think that our taxes aren't going to amount to anything anyway, because the bulk of money in our country is concentrated in the hands of the very wealthy people, or the wealthiest of the wealthy people. And because of this, it's unlikely that me paying taxes, or me choosing to not pay taxes rather, is going to lead to any kind of harm to my country's economy. So either you could be frustrated with the state, and believe that this law itself is unfair, or you could potentially believe that even if you do like the state, because of the way of the world and the way things are, doing the right thing and undergoing that personal inconvenience is not really going to lead to enough of a benefit for other people, even if that benefit is morally. If we are able to frame this as the biggest reason why the middle class does not want to comply to tax codes, and are also able to frame that they do have an alternative because of the strength of the informal sector, we can basically say that the middle class is now able to comply more, or is more willing to comply, because they believe that the system is more fair, because they believe that their taxes and the fact that they are paying taxes is actually going to have an end outcome, and the whole taxation system is actually going to have end outcomes in terms of better investment and better welfare and stuff, because the system is better. So this is one of the ways that you can use signaling as a mechanism to be able to come up with an extension, because what you're basically doing here is you're saying that the fact that we're passing this kind of policy signals to the people that there's going to be an increased burden on the rich, and there's going to be an increased amount of tax collection because of an increased burden on the rich, who have the vast majority of money. So you're able to prove something of an indirect impact that is not very contingent on enforcement and that kind of stuff. So you're able to sidestep potential opposition harms, and also trying to prove that this is maybe a certain delta in this debate in terms of people who didn't want to pay but now want to pay. I think this is maybe one potential argument that Siege can use. Another argument that I think that closing government can use is that this shakes up internal political makeup, and the reason for this, or at least the spec that gave me the idea for this extension, and I should have included this above in the spec area, is that there aren't really any anti-lobbying laws in Bulgaria. Not even like anti-lobbying laws. There is very limited legal acknowledgement of lobbying in Bulgaria, especially when you compare to other European Union countries, where in many cases lobbyists need to be registered, political donations are very closely tracked. If I'm not mistaken, and maybe I did dream this up, but if I'm not mistaken, there's even a few countries where there's a rule where the meetings between lobbyists and the representatives of political parties, their meetings need to be recorded, or at least minutes of the meeting need to be published and stuff like that. Whatever. It's not super relevant. What's relevant is the fact that the system in Bulgaria is very, very opaque. People don't know how much money lobbyists are giving. People don't know how strong these lobbyists are, which probably means that they are incredibly, incredibly strong. What this means is that the functioning of democracy in Bulgaria, in terms of the policies that the state executes actually being an expression of what people want, is probably not as high as it could be otherwise. So this is potentially a direct impact of this motion, which is that when you are now making the richest of the rich pay a very high amount in taxes, this fundamentally reduces their capacity to be able to lobby various political parties, and you can go in that entire direction with regards to what kinds of impacts that could have, and why that could lead to strengthening of democracy in Bulgaria. So again, this is not a harm that is contingent on the state using the collected money well. This is actually something that comes out of something that I said earlier in this session about how the two things that this motion is doing. It's giving more money to the state and taking more money out of the hands of rich people. So this is a direct consequence of taking that money out of the hands of the rich people. And if you know this spec, that anti-lobbying laws in Bulgaria, or at least lobbying regulatory laws in Bulgaria, are not very strong, you could use that spec to be able to explain that the impact of lobbyists in Bulgarian democracy is really, really high, which creates the need for this entire extension to even exist. Let's talk about some closing opposition extensions. So first is, again, this is kind of different from capital flight, because I don't necessarily want to talk about how the richest of the rich are running away, but more about the aspirations and the standard of those aspirations that are set in this country, which is that this policy is going to deter your urge for upward mobility. I also think that this is something that any competent opening opposition team would cover at least some avenue of, because I think that this is something of a very general premise that has a multitude of impacts, and I think there's genuinely millions of impacts. So you could talk about how young people leave, how you could talk about how young people don't try as hard. You could talk about how there's more manipulation of the public that happens from the state. You could talk about how firms end up staying smaller and don't have an incentive to really try to aggressively. You could talk about risk aversion in this society. I will note that all of these impacts are flippable. If not flippable, then they're at least mitigatable or mitigable, actually. But I do think that this premise itself is really strong, where when you start penalizing people for doing well, people don't want to do as well, because they think that what's the point in doing well if I'm going to get penalized? Any of these impacts could potentially be a complete case. If you have any knowledge about and I will admit that I don't. But if you have any knowledge about the youth culture in Bulgaria, how people from Gen Z and Gen Alpha really feel in this country, whether they feel excited and motivated or whether they're disillusioned, any of these things could potentially talk about how this is going to worsen that. And then for any of this stuff to stand, you would also have to explain the comparative. This is why maybe it wouldn't be very useful to talk about how people are sad and depressed, because it would be tough for you to explain why anything is better on your side. You could model and use fiat in better ways. I don't know. I do think that there's a bunch of different impacts, and there's many different directions that you could go very deep in. If you're on opening and you're able to identify this premise, you should at least attempt to cover as many of these impacts as possible with a few lines of analysis. If you're on closing, I would say that you should group these impacts into some specific stakeholders. For example, young people, for example, firms and risk aversion in firms, that kind of stuff. I said more manipulation, by the way. Actually, I now remember what I was thinking of. I was thinking of how, not corporates. Yeah, corporates are able to manipulate people better into, I don't know, not getting raises and that kind of stuff. Or how maybe there's less competition amongst people to be able to get promotions and that kind of stuff. I don't know. I think there's promise here, but I don't think this is my strongest work. I think that better economic impacts to be found on how firms remain small, and you can use this to also potentially have an alternative line to opening opposition's impact of capital flight and competition and all of that kind of stuff. About how their firms stay really small, or big firms, when there is monopoly or a duopoly or something, don't have any kind of incentive to innovate, which means that the competition that exists between these firms, even if it exists, is not really a very useful form of competition. It doesn't lead to good things for the consumer. And on the contrary, chances of things like collusion and stuff are much higher. If you're able to prove collusion, that is going to also be like I just said, is also going to be an alternative path for you to reach the O impacts that are stemming out of bad competition and stuff. Second CO case that I thought of, and I will also note that I think this is maybe a little reachier, but I think if you're able to prove this, it will be quite useful, which is that this increases the economic necessary burden that you need to fulfill for this is that enforcement is going to be bad. You need to be able to take down every single reason, or good reason at least, that Gov gives as to why they're going to be able to have good enforcement of this. You need to be able to prove that those reasons don't work. Here are some reasons as well as to why enforcement is going to be bad and collection won't happen very well. At the very least, you will need to be able to prove that evasion is going to be high on a gradient, that there are certain groups of people who are going to be able to evade this tax much better than other groups of people are. The purpose of this extension is basically to explain how the middle class is going to end up getting squeezed the most. So you could here explain that the taxes aren't just increasing for the richest of the rich; they are also going to be increasing from they are also going to be increasing for the middle class from the flat 10% rate that they currently have to pay. The middle class will have no ability to be able to run away from these taxes. The richest of the rich will have a very high ability, at least on a comparative to be able to run away from these taxes, which means that if Gov is correct and there is some augmentation to state capacity, that augmentation to state capacity is coming at the cost of pushing, of constricting the middle class much more, pushing more people from the middle class to lower economic classes. And even if in the best case of government they're able to increase welfare, you are also increasing the number of people that end up depending on this welfare because they're unable to keep up with these taxes and stuff. So if you're able to prove this, I think this ends up being a good way to resolve the debate as a whole entirely. If you're able to prove that certain sections of society that really need to have money but won't have money because of this. And there's a bunch of different follow-on impacts as well that you can prove. Like you can prove how the middle class won't be able to save money, what the impacts of less savings are, how that leads to, I don't know, more student debt for their kids and all that kind of stuff, how that leads to not being able to buy a house and renting for a longer period of time. We talk about evasion attempts and why there will at least be a higher number of attempts from the middle class to be able to evade, which increases the amount of money Gov has to spend on catching them and stuff. So there's a bunch of different things that you could prove. Say you could also prove that this is going to have negative signaling, at least in terms of in terms of how the middle class will feel they're being even more squeezed than they were by the previous taxation system. That the rich were getting away, yes, but now they're getting away more. When it was just 10%, they were at least willing to pay something. And to prove that, you're able to potentially, I mean, that's one of the reasons, but you could potentially prove how this increases in the country between different classes of people and why that's something that's bad for Bulgaria, because already a coalition government in Bulgaria, relatively sensitive coalition government in Bulgaria. So the idea is that you could take this premise of some people being able to evade taxes more than other people. Then you could get into the need of the people that aren't able to evade these taxes. Why do they need to have money? And you can accept a lot of the benefits on Gov and then trade them off. So this is also an extension strategy that you have, which is to be able to accept benefits that the other team is proving, but just trade them off by explaining that the harms are usually bigger. Are there better ideas than this? Probably yes. In fact, I'm sure there are. I think what you can do is you can use steps that maybe I use mentally to be able to come up with these better ideas yourself. If you are able to, please do drop them in the comments. If you have rebuttals to me, please drop them in the comments. But how did I come up with these ideas? The first method is something I already explained to you guys, which is you predict what the deadlock would be in the top half and try to resolve that deadlock. The second way is to find a stakeholder that is getting affected by this and create some kind of indirect impact. There are many ways to create indirect impacts. One of the best ways is to use processes like signaling, is to use how a policy or an action or a shift is perceived as opposed to direct impacts that opening teams usually rely on, are dependent on enforcement and quality of enforcement. Then you need to blow up that perception to explain what narratives can already exist in the society and how this can augment those narratives or change those narratives or whatever. Also find someone who needs that impact, and then you can talk about how therefore this is the most important impact in the debate, or how this is a very big harm because these people really needed to have money or whatever. So another example be that welfare isn't so bad when it's well funded, actually, which is to talk about how, okay, here's the analytical steps that you can go through for specific extension, which I do think is a fun extension, though I'm not sure how many judges would buy it. But I think what closing government would say is that when there is, so the problem that you need to talk about for this extension is there are many people who oppose welfare and investment in welfare. And when you ask them, hey, welfare is good, it's not just handing out freebies. These people that you give freebies to will eventually enter the education system and get educated, and then they will contribute to the country and your life will be better. Try to logically explain to a large number of people in any country that welfare is good economically and logically it's good. The response that they will give you is maybe it would be good in another country, but in this country it's never really done well, which is why people just end up becoming leeches onto the welfare system or whatever. So no matter how strong your logical persuasion is, what often happens is people are able to use the empirical reality of failing welfare systems to add to their confirmation bias that welfare just sucks. And this is bad because it leads to less political will for welfare, which becomes a snake eating its own tail. So when there's less political will for welfare, welfare is done worse, which means there's less political will for welfare, welfare is done worse, and so on and so on. You could do on closing government is potentially prove that when there is an augment to states' capacity, which is take opening government argument, you draw one impact, which is an increase in state capacity. This means that there are welfare systems that are failing, that will no longer be failing because they will be funded well. And the burden that you need to fulfill for this is that adding more money to welfare systems is actually going to make them more functional. It's not a very difficult burden to fill, in my opinion. If you do fill this, what you can then prove is that when welfare is done well, it actually does lead to all of those positive impacts for the economy and blah, 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 that people are actually able to see. So people are actually able to see a marginalized community they hate, for example, for being teachers on the country or whatever, doing well and contributing to the country. When they're able to have a more mitigated foundation for their otherization to validate their biases, this is all a good thing. And this will lead to more political will for welfare, which will lead to better welfare, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that welfare funding is not just good because it creates direct positive impacts to people, but it is also good because it allows for the compounding strengthening of the welfare system over a longer period of time. I think closing gov could prove this, and the way that you come to this extension is to use a process mechanism rather like signaling, and explain how kind of signal this policy or one of its impacts is going to have in terms of perception. There's also another way to be able to find a good extension impact, which is to find maybe a neutral seeming impact of the policy, and then you can maybe take it far enough for it to no longer be neutral. A good example of this, and I think that something that could not depend on, is to say that if the state really does manage to get an increased amount of capacity on opening government, it is uncertain in this debate as to whether that augmented capacity is going to be used well or not. Maybe it will be used well to a certain extent, but maybe not to the fullest extent that the best case of opening government would have you believe. If all of this is true, what else will be true? One thing that will be true is that the political will that opening government is using to be able to fuel their model for this kind of policy to even pass, that there is going to be an increase to state capacity, is probably also going to go in the opposite direction, in the sense that people will want less taxes of other sorts if this policy is big enough to augment state capacity significantly. So, for example, if this policy is leading to, I don't know, a revenue of $50 billion, means, and 50 billion brand new dollars that did not exist in status quo, people would be well within their rights and also incredibly likely to ask for reductions and relaxations in other forms of taxes. That these could be various forms of consumption taxes. For example, you have GST, you have VAT. Yes, tariffs can be considered consumption, not really, but there's a variety of different like consumption taxes, toll taxes, and that kind of stuff. So when there's going to be enough mobilization for the reduction in these taxes, and there's going to be better grounds for people to be able to demand a reduction in these taxes, what that could lead to is a reduction in these taxes. And the reduction in things like GST and VAT and all of these kinds of things, where you pay just a little bit less for every packet of chips and every packet of diapers for your children or whatever. This is a bigger benefit to your quality of life as compared to the harm that paying more income taxes is going to lead to. So you could basically just prove that there's going to be fewer consumption taxes, then there's going to be a reduced cost of living. Having fewer consumption taxes, in my opinion, in and of itself is a neutral seeming impact. It's basically just a neutralization of, okay, you're getting more money from here, which means you can take less money from here. What you can do is you can stretch it far and not stretch it, but you can take it far enough and do enough forward analysis to be able to find a follow-on impact of that neutral seeming impact that is not so neutral and useful for you. I think usually this also ends up being a decent strategy to be able to come up with innovative impacts in economics rounds, because often what ends up happening is most teams just concede to your neutral impacts because they think they sound quite neutral, and they don't focus on attacking the premise too much because they think they can weaponize it, or they think that this is not a very contentious or this premise does not need to be very contentious in the debate, allows for you to be able to build unchallenged relatively. So yeah, I think that's about it for this motion breakdown. I hope you guys found it interesting. Please do leave any feedback that you might have for future motion breakdowns. And thank you so much. Bye-bye. Good night.